I'm here. I'm back. Like I said, I would be with another story. This one, I'm really not sure how it's going to play out because the chapters look really short. So we'll see. I'm going to read, but I'm also going to be reading multiple chapters. I think this one may have been a work in progress, but we'll find out together because I thought it was going to be like possibly a third novel in this series, like part of the trilogy, but I'm not sure. So we'll find out. Good, bad, ugly. If it gets too terrible, I will stop. Maybe. Anyway, without further ado, I have the Wolf Talisman, and I think it may have a working title, like a tagline: "When the Empire Stirs." Okay, and then chapter 1. In Throde, capital of Haladania. Two brothers faced each other across the bier on which lay the body of their father. They disliked each other quite thoroughly, though in public they must act like brothers. The older, Laron int Ragon, was the larger, though some of that size was across the belly. People said behind his back that the 3 days he must go without wine on account of his father's death were a severe trial to him. His arms were thick and muscular, and his round face sported a red beard that came near to being unkempt. Dalam int Ragon, his younger brother, was smaller and lighter, quick of movement and fastidiously clean. People said behind his back that he had a long, cruel memory, remembering slights against himself and paying them back with a smiling vindictiveness. His beard, unlike his brother's, was short, clipped, and neat. They were careful in their treatment of each other, knowing that all eyes were on them here. Their father had been thrown in a hunting accident, and never regained consciousness. He had not named his heir before the accident, and though the older brother had some rights of seniority, the rule in Haladania was that the nobles would elect the king, usually from among the heirs of the king. Even so, an indication of preference by the late Ragon for one or the other would have made up minds of many nobles. The older brother gave a sign, and certain chosen nobles came forward to lift the bier. The two fell in behind it, and a procession followed them out of the tomb of the kings, where a grave had been prepared. Dalam scowled briefly at that, then quickly blanked his expression. There would be a time of mourning, and after 6 weeks the great assembly of nobles would meet to choose their ruler. That would be time enough to work. Laron was also thinking of the great assembly. He knew he had the advantage, being the elder son, but perhaps it would be a good idea to do something about Dalam. The man had quite a reputation for devious plots, and the empire of Atascon making the southern border uneasy. It was best that Haladania have one single ruler. And that is chapter 1 already. Yeah, so 1 page. Chapter 2. 3 weeks later, in the county of Imcoro, Dalwyn int Arnalon, Count of Imcro, looked out at the still waters of the bay. Another week, and he must be on his way to Throde to cast his vote for the High King of Haladania. He would be voting for the older brother, of course. There was little to choose between Laron and Dalam, but Laron was the elder for all that mattered. He was also a man given to pursuing his own pleasures, and it was said that the prostitutes of Throde all knew him by sight. He was also a welcome sight to the innkeepers and wine sellers, but he was also a proven leader of men. Dalam had led men into battle, and done so successfully, but he was known for doing things his way or no way, revenging himself on anyone who crossed him. A wastrel, or a conniving brute! Such choices we are given. He only realized he had spoken out loud when a Wallen said, "Your pardon, Lord?" He turned and looked. Wallen in Ostark was a little shorter than his own 6 feet, and dressed in bright red breeches and green tunic, which complemented his own somber brown. The both of them had red hair and beards. The Wallens were becoming streaked with grey. As a matter of course, carried long swords belted at the hip. Only remarking on our choices for High King, old friend. Wallen is perhaps the only man with whom Dalwyn could be completely honest. Wallen allowed himself a small smile. High Kings come and High Kings go. The land continues in spite of them. You say that in the wrong quarters, Dalwyn said with a smile, and Dalam will have you in his torture chamber. Wallen snorted. Have you known me from the days when you were first weaned to say things in the wrong quarters? Am I a complete fool then in my old age? Ah, your old age, yes indeed. And who was it just wore me out on the practice ground with swords only a little while ago? But have you heard of the most recent rumor? Dalam is approaching the Emperor of Ataskan for assistance in claiming the crown. Ha! Who would respect a man who brought the emperor to give him the crown? If he were backed by imperial armies, he wouldn't need respect. From what I know of him, Dalam would settle for being feared. You really think he would bring in the empire? All it is rumor, old friend. I could hope you wouldn't do anything foolish. Oh well, let's get back to the citadel. They walked up along the curved streets to the citadel. Dwalin knew the duties of his office would be waiting for him when we returned. Disputes to be judged, orders to be given, laws to be announced. It was only on brief occasions that he was able to take some time away from those duties to rest a little by the waterfront. He felt the Wolf Talisman against his chest. It was only 4 weeks now since he'd been able to use the thing. To let himself run through the hills, smelling the smells of wilds, enjoying the weather. 5 weeks ago that his father had died, and beginning shortly after that, there'd been little time for enjoyment. They went into the citadel through the hidden way, pulling up the hoods of their cloaks to remain unknown in the crowds. The hidden way involved a secret door and a dark, winding staircase. Torches were kept at both top and bottom, to be lit and carried up or down as necessary. The stairway ended at another doorway, this one hidden in the back of a large closet in the inner chamber of the Lord Imcro. Extinguishing their torches, they went out into the inner chamber, and from there into the hall of council. Wallen strode in first to announce him. This is something Dalwyn was still getting used to. He had known, of course, that he would fall heir to the rights and duties of his father, but he had not thought of his father as old enough to die, and it was only just coming to him that he was Lord of Imcro now, and that this was him that was announced, him that the assembled people stood for. He looked around the room. Mostly it was full of bright colors, solids and checks of his own people. In one corner was a little knot of Ataskan merchants wearing the voluminous white robes used on formal occasions, and in another corner were a few Makar. The Makar were as tall as a man, with short fur ranging from grey to tan, with patches of white in the armpits. They dressed in much the same way as humans on the land, though their clothing was usually solid colors. Many grown males would wear a narrow headband with a feather or two stuck in it to slant down toward the back of the neck. In this group he recognized Lodasani, whom he had always considered a good friend. What was he wanting here, in this time set aside for justice? Well, his father had always taught him that justice should be available to all, though there were no few of his human compatriots who would differ with him on that point. According to tradition, when he took his seat, the seekers for justice all began to clamor at once for his attention. It was up to him to designate which case he would hear, in which order. There must be a better way than this, he muttered to himself as the uproar commenced. He stood. Again, according to tradition, silence fell. He looked out over the eager faces and pointed to a man at the back. "You, there! What's your case?" He sat down again. Silence still reigned, as that man and several others made their way to the front. It turned out to be a case of a borrowed ox, which had died while in the care of the borrower. The owner of the ox was demanding full compensation, but the borrower had insisted the ox had been sick when he had borrowed it, so he was not responsible at all. After listening to several witnesses, Dalwyn realized that the ox had probably indeed been sick when borrowed. On the other hand, the fellow who borrowed the ox had worked the sick beast as hard as if it were a healthy one. Dalwyn gave his decision. The ox was sick when it was borrowed, and both of you knew it. If poor treatment had caused the animal to sicken after it was borrowed, you'd be liable for compensation. As the man was about to begin smiling in triumph, Dalwyn went on. However, you knew the beast was sick, and yet you worked it as hard as if it was well. That cannot have but helped to kill the ox. Therefore, I hold that you owe this man half the cost. As he watched the faces, Dalwyn recalled something his father had said. In this kind of case, if both sides seem equally unhappy with the decision, it was probably right. The noise started again. He stood and pointed at Ludasani. Ludasani came forward. 2 humans came with him, both glowering in it with anger. Who bears the complaint here? Ludasani spoke. Lord, for years upon years it had been agreed that the Makar rule themselves within their own boundaries and should not be harassed. Stone cairns were established to mark the borders of Makar territory. This spring, we find that one of the cairns had been moved, to our detriment. From what we were able to determine, moved on the orders of this man, Kopar int Golon. He pointed with his chin toward the older of the 2 humans who had come forward with him. Dalwyn's heart sank. This was probably going to be one of those dragged-out cases where he would have to send a trusted person to the site of the cairn to determine whether or not it had been moved. He turned to look at Kopar. What have you to say about this? Kopar was a heavy-set man, of black hair and beard, with a scar on his right cheek. He was still scowling. Lord, this is a waste of your time and mine. What right have these animals on our land? Dalwyn felt his frown building. They have the rights of any other who feel themselves to be wronged. They have the rights of their own property and lands. What do you say to this charge? Lord, surely you won't take the word of this animal over one of your loyal subjects. With an effort, Dalwyn forced himself to keep his seat. Kopar, Ludasani and his people are no more animals than you or I, and I will not necessarily take anyone's word over anyone else's. Now suppose I ask you again. Was the boundary cairn moved? And before you answer, if I should send someone to inspect the cairn and find that it was indeed moved, I would take a dim view of anyone who tells lies before my face. He had watched his father administer justice and remembered seeing Arnalon frown an offender into submission. He wondered if he had inherited some of that ability, for Kopar looked hesitant, glanced down at his feet, and muttered something. What did you say, Kopar? He attempted to make his voice firm, but not uncaring. It would have come out much differently. Kopar looked up. Lord, it may be the cairn was shifted a bit in this spring's ploughing. There was land that was not being used, and some of my folk needed space to plant their grain. I see. If I require you to see that the cairn is moved back to its proper place, I can trust to have that done properly. I would not like to have Ludasani bring the same case before me again in 3 weeks' time. I will see to it, Lord. Kopar was not entirely happy, but neither did he have any right on his side, nor enough backing from friends and neighbors to press his case further. So it went on. Strayed cows, thefts, trespassing, and the like. The Makar merchants who had made their trek over the mountains from Imkro of Atatskan were complaining that certain merchants of the city of Imkro were using false weights. Dalwyn sighed inwardly when that case came up. Weights and measures varied from country to country, sometimes even from city to city, which meant there were always questions. And there were merchants who, knowing that foreign merchants might be unfamiliar with the local system, attempted to cheat the visitors. In this case, certain local merchants had been using a cubit measure slightly shorter than standard. As he was giving his judgment, Dalwyn considered that the whole matter could well be up in the air again in a few weeks' time, when the new High King of Haladania was chosen. At that time, the new king might well declare the cubit should be measured according to his standard, from elbow to outstretched fingertips, inevitably being different from the standard of his father. Dalwyn knew there were times when his father had not heard every pending case, but he still felt himself too new to do that yet. As a result, he was tired, hungry, and thirsty by the time he finished administering justice. He had the beginnings of a headache as well. As he got up from his chair, he looked at his companion. "Let us get out of this room, Wallen, and let's preferably go to some place where there's a mug of beer and a bit of roast beef." Was not entirely sympathetic. "There were too many of them this morning. You should have quit sooner." He forced himself to smile as they walked from the room. "If I did that, they'd just come back again tomorrow. Might as well get rid of them all today." Wallen merely grunted. "What did you think of that affair between Ludasani and Kopar Intgolan?" "Intgolan can be nasty, but I don't think you need worry about him just yet. There might be others who would have been harder to back down in the same case." "What about you, Wallen? Do you hate the Makar too?" Wallen shrugged as he filled his beer mug. "There's some of them good and some of them bad, just like everywhere else. But they look different. So there's some that can't believe they're more than animals. Biggest problem is there so few of them." Dalwyn took a drink, considering this. He'd heard it before, how the Makar had small families, not enough to match the more numerous and prolific humans. Well, they're part of our country. They deserve our protection. And that was chapter 2. Like I said, super short. Chapter 3. The city of Imkro. 2 weeks further on. Dalwyn wondered just what was happening. Dalam Intragan had come for a visit 4 days ago, and as yet had not deigned to reveal the purpose of this visit. In such a case as this, one might expect that he was hoping for Dalwyn's support in election for the High King. But Dalwyn knew very well that his county was small enough and far enough out of the way that he had little influence on the other nobles of the country. One did not, of course, go up to the man who might possibly be the king and ask him, "What do you want here?" So he escorted Dalam around the city, showing him this and that, entertaining him at night and waited for him to decide for himself that the time was right to reveal his purpose in coming to Imkro. At this point they were riding around the city, with Dalwyn showing off the walls and fortifications. There was little else to do. If Dalwyn were not more forthcoming, Dalwyn would have to begin inventing things to amuse him. Pounding hooves sounded from behind, and a messenger pulled up beside Dalwyn. Lord Ataskan ships have been sighted off the coast, and they seem to be making for the port." "Ataskan ships? How many?" his thoughts went rushing. If the Empire were indeed attacking, he would have to assemble his warriors to fight them, very likely even calling his neighbors for assistance. Depending on how many Atascans there were, much of his land might well suffer before they could be driven off. He turned to Dalam. Lord, I must go see what this is about. It might be better for you to prepare to leave quickly if they are attacking. Let me ride to the port with you. If it seems really necessary, I can leave quickly. Dalam's eyes were strangely bright, and Dalwyn wondered what was going on behind those eyes. If you wish, Lord. He had no time to waste in trying to convince the other to be sensible. He sent his horse off at a run through the winding streets toward the harbor. The galleys were coming in, cutting through the water. Their numbers took Dalwyn's breath away. He turned to one of the young men who served him. Leighton, go have the summons started. We'll meet in 5 days' time at... Your pardon, Lord Dalwyn, but there's something you ought to know. Dalam spoke quietly but forcefully. Dalwyn looked at him. I have made an arrangement, you see. The Atascan troops are coming to assist me in seeing to it that my brother does not soil the high throne with his backside. Dalwyn was too astounded to be polite and circumspect. You've made an arrangement with the Atascan? Will the cost of their help be bearable for the land? The cost? That is one reason why I chose to be here at this time. The cost is the county of Imcro. Don't worry. They have promised that your position and your rights will be respected in the Empire. But consider your position before you do anything rash. There will be no help coming from the High King of Haladania. Dalwyn was suddenly aware that Dalam's own bodyguard were close in around their master, ready to fight and, if necessary, deliver him from danger. For his own part, Dalwyn had only Wallen and his lightly armored young men with him. A skirmish at this moment might not help, though it might resolve the situation well, leaving Dalwyn dead with no son to heir after him. By the time an heir was found, the Atascan would probably have established themselves firmly in the land. Best he should let things be and do the best he could for his people. As Dalam had said, the country of Imcro would be fighting alone. As you wish, my lord. He caught a glimpse of Wallen's impassive face and wondered if the older man despised him for surrendering so easily. Dalam relaxed slightly. Dalwyn had a feeling the young prince had almost hoped for resistance. Well then, let us go down to meet our guests. Chapter 4. Another 3 days further on, still in the city of Imcro. Haltad Imprian Atalto looked around his quarters. He shuddered. Bare stone, a few decorations, plain furniture, and this was the home of a high lord among the barbarians? Well, he knew that the situation was going to be unpleasant, at least in the beginning. Once he had settled himself in power, he would see to it he was provided with the proper quarters and the like. He had convinced the emperor to support this venture, though the emperor had not been fully as supportive as Haltad might have liked. He scowled at the memory. The chubby emperor smiled from his throne. The problem, my dear Haltad, he explained, is that though we took the island of Selsha from the Tumulia rather easily, the people of that confounded island continue to resist our rule in petty ways. This means we have to keep a fairly large armed force on the island at all times. However, I rather like your proposal, and what we know of the people of Haladania, we may be able to occupy the whole country within a few years, putting an end to the raids that they've made on us from time to time. I will therefore supply you with 4,000 spearmen, 200 archers. I am sure the men of your talents can succeed with such a force. It could be worse than useless to argue with the emperor, so he had taken what was offered. His Highness was correct after all. The force he was allotted would be sufficient to put this Dalam on the throne and ensure the territory of Imcro was secure. He had had to gather 200 cavalry on his own initiative and had kept this a secret. Private citizens were not encouraged to gather private armies. If His Highness had ever asked, these would be a bodyguard. He hoped to be able to occupy Imcro itself with little or no fighting. To that end, he had made an entrance not as a prospective conqueror, but more as a guest, and had brought his daughter Halisi along with him. It meant assigning her a bodyguard day and night, but he felt it worth the troops who must be kept from the battlefield. He had talked to Prince Dalam about the possibility of training some of his people to fight in the Ataskan style, in massed ranks with shield and long spear. The prince had been a little hesitant, but Atalto was sure he could convince him of the wisdom of the move. It was not as if every man in the force he had brought was Ataskan. There were some fighting from the island of Chima, some from Salsha, and a few exiles from Tumulia, who had learned the Ataskan way of fighting. With any luck, they would be able to put the prince on his throne with only 1 or 2 battles, then stay around to ensure his reign was sure. They could then pull back into Imcro to plan the next move. The move that would make all of Haladania part of the Ataskan Empire. There was a quick rap at his door, and one of his guards leaned in to speak to him. "Sir, a messenger from the prince. Bring him in." He was not yet willing to meet with any Haladanian alone, no matter who he might be. He recognized the man being as one of the sturdy men who made up the prince's bodyguard. "What is it?" He knew he sounded abrupt, but his command of the language was not secure. He had learned the dialect spoken across the mountain in the place called Imcro of Ataskan, but had discovered the language spoken here differed somewhat. Well, with 4,000 spearmen at his command, he needn't worry too much about being polite to a barbarian. "Sir," the messenger said, "Prince Dalam invites you to dine this evening in the great hall of the Count of Imcro." "Ah, very good. Thank His Highness for me, and assure him that I will be there." As he walked to the great hall, he considered the coming dinner. His daughter would be there. As was the barbarian fashion, though the women withdrew after the meal to allow the men to become drunk and foolish, he had settled himself thoroughly. He would introduce civilized manners so that men and women dined separately save on special occasions. Of course, Count Dalwyn would be there as well. The Count was a negligible factor. He had to be treated with some deference at the present, but in a few years he could be disposed of altogether. He seemed rather dazed with this new situation. Well, that was better than having him make plots and plans against his new rulers. Even so, he would have to be watched. Haltod Narasio, Halisi walked to the great hall with 2 large pikemen in front and 2 behind her. She was a little tall for an Ataskan lady. She had never heard her father make such comments when he wondered how he would ever make a match for her. He had heard her father make such comments when he wondered how he would ever make a match for her, when she towered over so many of the eligible lords. She was slender and well-shaped, though the shape did not show much through the heavy folds of blue and white feasting gown she wore. Her jet-black hair was piled on top of her head and held there with several pins. On the whole, she was feeling happy. She knew why her father had brought her along on this expedition, but she was used to having him thinking of her as a thing that could be used to further his plans. She knew she had very little say in her future, and whatever she might do would have to be in a roundabout fashion. Her father, like all men of Ataskan, arranged things to suit themselves, with little consideration for the feelings of women. On the other hand, she might be able to affect the choice of her husband, but only if she could suggest some fault in the chosen man. Even then, she could not simply confront her father, but would have to work by offhand suggestions and allusions. She sighed. Well, this is certainly a beautiful country, however she came to be here. She picked up a bit of language from the slaves who had been born in Imcro of Ataskan, but the way it was spoken here was different. She would have to enjoy herself while she could. Oh my goodness. Okay, hold on. Did I mention this might be a first draft? It might be a first draft. It's sounding very much like a first draft. They entered the banquet hall. The count was seated at the end of the room on a raised chair. The prince, Dalam, was seated beside him in a slightly higher chair. The chair in which her father would sit, on the other side of the prince, was at the same level as the count. Her father would chafe at that. A noble of the Ataskan Empire equated with some barbarian count? The count sat beside the prince, looking rather bewildered. She suspected the prince had come to him with this plan of his, giving him no chance to discuss the matter or do anything save accept it. She felt a twinge of pity for him. Dalwyn glanced around the room listlessly. The prince had decided to give a dinner in honor of his new allies. It was not mandatory that Dalwyn attend, but whatever he was going to do to save Imcro from the fate of Salsha, he could not do it if he was completely separated from all that was going on. He smiled a little grimly at the Lord Haltod as the Lord Haltod took his place. The Ataskan would find things different here from back home. Dalwyn had learned considerably about the Empire from the traders who visited Imcro. He knew, for instance, that dinners such as this tended to be very political occasions, with agreements and understandings bartered back and forth. That was not to say such things did not go on at a Haladanian banquet, but many good Haladanians considered such things to be poor manners. Lord Halted was a well-kept man, looking as tough as an old boot, square-jawed with iron grey hair and beard. He did not seem to be a man who would be particularly understanding of local customs and sensibilities, no matter what sort of deal he had made with Dalam. One thing to be said in his favor, he had taken the trouble of learning the language of the people among whom he would be living. Granted, he learned the dialect of Imcro of Ataskan, which had some differences, but he could make himself understood. Haltod Narasio Halisi made her entrance, with four of the soldiers who accompanied her everywhere. Dalwyn felt a tingle of irritation at that. Does that Ataskan oaf think his precious daughter is in so much danger here? Would I hurt a woman to get back at him? The prince took a look at him, but Dalwyn knew he had not spoken loudly enough to be heard. He went back to considering the fate of his country. The same Ataskan merchants who had told him how things were done in the Empire had also told him of how the island of Salsha fared when it was taken into the Empire. The Ataskan language was enforced, imperial weights and measures installed, imperial laws set in place. All this was backed up by Ataskan soldiers, and infractions were punished by fines. There was a joke that all these fines were going to pay the wages of the imperial soldiers who were stationed on the island. There is recently a rumor that the Empire had established another law which defined such jokes as being sedition, which should be punished accordingly. Dalwyn had a little difficulty imagining the people of Imcro being punished for making jokes. When he really thought about it, however, it seemed too likely an outcome. He fingered the talisman on the cord beneath his shirt. There was a strong temptation to leave the hall after tonight's meal, change to a wolf, and never come back. He sighed. No, he couldn't do that. There might not be much he could do to protect his people from the fate of Salsha, but he couldn't desert them. He spent a good deal of the next day wandering around the city. Lord Haltod had assigned him an honor guard, all men who understood at least a little Haladanian. Haltod explained to him that this was a mark of honor, though Dalwyn was fairly sure there was as much to report on his movements as anything else. So, 6 soldiers wearing corselet and helmet, armed with pike and short sword, marched in front of and behind him wherever he went. He smiled slightly. Perhaps it was an indication of his importance that he'd had 2 more guards than the Haltod's daughter. He turned in at the shop of Oltwin, the talisman maker. There was no room for 6 soldiers inside the little shop, so 3 of them had to wait outside. Even the 3 who came inside had to hold their spears aslant because of the low ceiling. Oldwin was a small man of indeterminate age. He smiled at the group as they came in. "Ah, Count Dalwin! You bring new customers to me." The soldiers remained totally expressionless as the Count replied, "No, these are my honor guard, a marker of how well I am thought of by the Emperor of Ataskan. I have merely come for myself, to see what new things you have on hand." "New? New? Nothing much new here since your last visit. I had one that could turn soldiers into toads, but I sold it. Would you be interested in something such as that?" "Turning soldiers into toads?" he considered. "No, I think not. After all, why would I want to turn soldiers into toads? Anything else?" He felt rewarded by the way the soldiers twitched a little at the conversation. "No, not much. I do have some scrying talismans made by Makar sorcerers." "I thought you told me once some time long ago that scrying talismans weren't of much use." "Yes, I did. Most of them have a success rate of 3 times in 10. Makar sorcerers seem to be able to do a bit better. These ones are successful 4 to 5 times out of 10. Still not very good, are they? And of course you have no way of knowing which predictions are correct." "No, that's true. But talismans have never been very useful for scrying. I have a few Makar speaking talismans as well." "Speaking talismans?" "Yes, they allow you to speak to another who is far away. Speak as if they were standing right beside you. The only difficulty with them is they come in pairs, and you can only speak to the person who has the mate to yours. Some of them are single use, others can be used more often. Of course, the ones which can be used more than once need to be worn on your person constantly in order to maintain their magic." They spent a little while in idle conversation, and then talking about the different difficulties of making talismans, of the advantages of making talismans for single use over talismans that might be used over and over again, and so on. Oldwin was one of the few who knew of the Wolf Talisman Dalwin wore, and had asked him once or twice to look at it to see how difficult it would be to duplicate it. Dalwin had never quite felt right doing so Altwin had eventually stopped asking. When he finally left the shop, the guards were at least a little nervous, and Dalwin felt a little malicious satisfaction in that fact. Okay, I love this chapter. Chapter 5. About the same time, in the kingdom of Tumulia. It was a fine old palace, built and added to by the generations of kings, dating from the time when Tumulia was merely a trading center, commanding a few towns in its area by its comparative size. Tumulia was an empire now, ruling a vast expanse of territory, and able to enforce its will on certain small countries adjacent to it. The manners of the empire had changed as well, though no emperor would really believe that. There were stories coming from the old times, even old stone inscriptions, which seemed to hint that the ruler of Tumulia was once a person of medium power. In his throne room, Ogon Dar Sathal looked around at the various princes and dignitaries surrounding him. Many were hoping to catch his eye to beg a favor from him. No few others were hoping he would not notice them and call them to account for some failing of which they were all too aware. He was dressed in the robe of state, a lightweight, loose-fitting garment which covered him from throat to ankles, and the cone-shaped crown of Tumulia was on his head. He maintained a solemn and a serious expression, though inwardly he was amused by the attitudes of various members of his court. His eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he could not always make out those further away, but he had only to whisper to one of his many servants to have them go and take a message to a certain man to stand forward, and that one would do so. If he were feeling a little vindictive, which seemed to be happening more and more often these days, he would let the man stand for a little while before speaking, to allow him to worry just about why he'd been called forth. Most of these notables present were also wearing court dress, similar sorts of robes, but their heads were bare. Mostly their heads were bare. There were certain ones who were allowed to wear a golden tiara, and a history described how no few of those had managed to exchange the tiara for a crown. Oh my goodness, sorry. But Ogun had a very extensive corps of informers and investigators who kept him abreast of various plots and plans among his subordinates. A carefully publicized arrest and execution here, a sly poisoning there, had kept him secure on his throne for many years. He grimaced. He was tired of all this, and he had dealt with the most important questions of his nobles could bring forth. If there was anything more, it could wait till tomorrow. He turned to one of his servants. "The session is over. I wish to see the princes in my private chamber." The servant bowed and quickly went to the chamberlain, who announced the end of the session. The servant continued on his way to seek the princes, while the emperor stood and left the room. The two princes attended their father shortly. After sufficient delay to assert their autonomy, but not sufficiently to fully arouse his anger, the two princes were nearly similar enough to be twins. Tall, strong young men, dark hair, dark eyes, remembered their mothers. They wore pants and tunics, loose-fitting, bright-colored, and each wore a turban of white. Ogun was old, but he still remembered their mothers. Narbol Dar Ogun, the eldest, was the son of one of the women he had chosen for himself, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Beautiful as a flower, but unfitted for palace intrigues. She had died soon after the birth of her son. He had dealt with that plot harshly, he remembered, even more harshly than was his wont. Tulog Dar Ogun, on the other hand, was the son of an inland lord, given to him in the course of treaty negotiations. She had been the woman of spirit, perhaps too much spirit. She tried to put herself on the throne as a regent for her son, and had managed to develop considerable support. This had been the early days of Ogun's network of informers and enforcers indeed. It had been one of the reasons for developing this group to its present extent. He had considered himself a fair man, and therefore did not hold a babe in arms responsible for the acts of his mother. On the other hand, he had spies constantly watching Tulog, just in case he should suddenly show some foolish desire to revenge his mother. He watched the two approaching him. He wondered how they managed to make their entrance at exactly the same time, since he knew there was a fierce rivalry between them. Surely at least one or the other ought to have managed to arrive sooner, in an attempt to favorably impress their father. There had been hints that he ought to name a successor in order to ensure an orderly succession. His own feeling that naming a successor was likely to be a serious danger to him. He smiled at the two, as though the three of them were simply part of an ordinary family. "Thank you for coming, my sons. Is it well with you?" "It is well." They pronounced the greeting formula in chorus, though they still managed to sound as though it were no mere formula. He allowed himself a smile. "I am happy to see you both, and happy to see you well, but I would ask a favor of you." Narbol answered just ahead of his brother. "Father, you know you need not ask favors. I am your obedient son. You need only speak, and I will heed." Ogun did not smile at this, though he felt like laughing. "The difficulty is this, my sons. I know that both of you have been extremely angry at the loss of the island of Celsha, but this is not the time to be stirring up matters with the Atascan Empire. We have the Quisach in the Quisach in the north, constantly threatening the borders of our inland territory, Tulia Taldish. We cannot afford to fight a war on two fronts. You understand?" "Yes, father," they agreed simultaneously. He looked at Narbol. "The Empire has complained about pirates harassing the coasts of Celsha. In most circumstances, I would say good. Do as you will. But if the Empire decides to declare war, we could be crushed between them and the Quioshach. He looked at Tulug. They have also been complaining that monies have been provided to dissident groups on the island, and indicated their deep concerns over this. I say, it cannot go on. At present, I am willing to offer only warnings, but I will tell you this. I will not have our realm put in mortal danger because of some young fool and his ideas of pride and respect. He considered that he had dismissed them rather a little brusquely, but if either of them took that too seriously, well, he had his spies and informers watching, and though they might think they had discovered all the informers in their entourage, he is quite certain they had not. He sighed. His advisors could give him no certain reasons why the Quioshach were being so obstreperous. Oh my goodness, why? Obstreperous lately. The greatest likelihood was that there had been extensive crop failures in their lands, so they were trying to make up the shortfall by attacking Tulia Saldish. There is also some possibility that a leader had arisen among them to unite the tribes, or most of them, and in order hold them united. He was sending raids down into Tumulia. Otherwise, they would have had to be fighting among each other. Again, there was a chance that the tribes among the Quioshach were pressing against them for some reason, causing them to have to move out southward. At any rate, this was not the proper time for a war with the Tascan. He felt he made his point with the two, but he would have them watched. It was even possible that one or the other of them would disobey him blatantly enough to force him into action, which would solve the succession problem for sure. He called for one of his secretaries. He would have to make notes of the orders that were given, and notes regarding orders to be given. He loved his sons, but he could not allow them to endanger the kingdom. Okay, so that was the first 5 chapters. There are 32 chapters in the story, but they're all about that short. They're very, very short chapters. I'm pretty sure at this point that it is a first draft, so bear with me. I'm going to try and make this as cohesive as possible. Think of it as a challenge for myself. You're a storyteller. But yeah, I will be back again tomorrow night reading another bunch of parts. Probably again another 5 chapters. I'll be doing that every night until I leave, which will be, I'll probably have to do a little bit extra because I just realized. That's okay. I'll bring it up more when I talk to you. So until tomorrow night, good night.